Hello and welcome back to Ethics TV, episode 27. And this is with Mariana Olaizola Rosenblat, who is joining me from a long way away today. And I'm really honored to have her join, largely because my brilliant person, my right-hand person, Justine, was researching potential guests for Ethics TV. And she sent me an article from January the 27th of this year, 2025, entitled How Meta Turned Its Back on Human Rights. And I'm going to actually, firstly, Mariana, hello, thank you for joining. and I'm gonna read out the first two sentences of the article that we found of yours, because this is my preferred starting point, if you allow. So the article that you wrote, that was published, started with these wordings. That was the guaranteed addition to Ethics TV guest. You made the bar by far. Quote, Meta has never been a paragon of principle. From its careless handling of users' personal data to its acquiescence in the face of foreign authoritarian government censorship demands, Meta has provided many reasons to doubt its commitment to human rights. But for a time, the company made what seemed like a good faith effort to improve its track record. Now, instead of continuing to lead its company down the path of progress, Meta's founder and CEO Mark Zuckerberg has chosen to disregard long-standing human rights norms in favor of a simplistic and politically expedient approach to free speech. So rather than ask you any questions about this article specifically and test your memory of something that I'm sure was a long time ago in writing, how did you arrive at writing this? And was this something that you've monitored for a while? Are you in the is this a suspicion that you've had that's been bubbling, or was this something that was specifically being researched at that time? How did you come to write this?
So, as part of the Center for Business and Human Rights at NYU Stern, we engage with companies all the time. I've been, having conversations with Meta on many different human rights issues related to their handling of user data, data privacy of its users, related to their approach to content moderation. For a while, since I started in my job, we believe in constructive engagement, of being tough critics, but engaging with companies just to kind of first learn from their perspective what the human rights issues we identify, how they're dealing with them, what the challenges are from their perspectives, but also for us to then share what we view as pragmatic recommendations on how to do better. With human rights, you can never, maximally fulfill all of them. There's some, tensions, and it's sort of always a work in progress. But for a time, my engagement with Meta seemed to suggest that these many people in the company were trying hard to push some things along to improve. At times it became obvious that they wanted to, for example, the trust and safety staff, or people working on privacy, they really agreed with me in conversations, even people relatively high up, but they just couldn't convince like the highest leadership to make certain changes. But they would make the ones that were under their purview. When this announcement from Meta hit, it was clear that whatever efforts were going on within the company were going to come to a halt, because Mark Zuckerberg came out and said in very plain terms, we're pivoting. This kind the initiatives that we've been undertaking under the mantle of increasing safety and reducing harassment, and all kinds of really bad things that can happen on social media. He said, now we're going back to our roots. This is verbatim what he said, of free speech. For me, what rung in my ears was this justification of freedom of expression, which is a human right, but used in a very disingenuous way, to basically say, because of free speech, we're going to allow all kinds of harm to occur. We're not going to be proactively policing them anymore. There are specifics to that, which we can get to, but As a human rights lawyer, I know that one can protect freedom of speech while also protecting people from harm. So this kind of paying lip service to a right that's a right, a constitutional right in the US, as in many democracies, and also a human right, international human right. It was a very cheap kind of allusion to this right, as a way to justify paring back on a lot of efforts that the company had been, and many people inside the company have been working on, and the leadership seemingly going along with. But now, because of the political um, climate shifting, um, the leadership was willing to just dismantle the whole thing. So that was very upsetting to a lot of people, and kind of a marker of just a broader shift in Silicon Valley. Um, this kind of sense that, oh, what we had been doing, we did under because of public pressure, right? We needed to improve certain practices, but now under this new political reality, we can just pull that back, and you know be happy that we're not going to be regulated, at least in the US. We can start talking about other countries which are really very active on the regulatory front and how complicated the landscape gets. But um, basically, I took that as a sign that if Meta's going this way, other companies will as well. And indeed, I wrote another piece recently about Google and its backsliding on human rights. It's very worrisome. I think one thing we can do is call it out as it is, and call out the bluff if someone's saying, "Oh, freedom of speech." It's no, if we look at human rights norms, this is not how you prioritize freedom of speech. Um, but also to propose, I think always important to say, if you really want to protect free speech, this is how you do it affirmatively, not just criticize, but point to a better way to do it, because that's, I think, the way that we win over the public, and especially in the US, where a majority of the public voted for something contrary to what we've been working on. It's important to win back public opinion through, I think, pragmatic and affirmative solutions rather than just criticism.
Yeah. Do you think that there is um, a genuine care for human rights in the technology boards of directors, or do you feel that human rights drops solely into the legal overhead budget line and something that, oh, oops, we got found out again? We need to kind of address this either by settling out of court or by even changing our internal policies to avoid future bullets. Or do you think human rights are part of what an ethical purpose of a business is? Where do you think it sits in people's agenda?
It varies by company leader, and board, and I think it's hard to generalize. In the biggest tech companies, what I see is not a firm commitment to human rights, as one can see in Patagonia as an example of it's a different sector altogether, parallel, but it's a company that is structured in a way and led by someone who really believes in sustainability and human rights, and treating workers fairly and so forth, and they operate that way. With a big tech, it's always seemed to me like they will do it if public pressure is strong enough. Um, if their users demand it, if they can avoid another scandal, or if they're caught in a scandal, then they'll take some measures. Usually more rhetorical than actual. But when there's pressure, they were starting to do things. So even if not willingly or happily, they were responding to public demands. Um, when it became politically legitimate or expedient to shift, they did so quickly. Um, so no, I think that signals to me that there wasn't a genuine commitment to human rights, and really the only way, at least for the tech sector, the big tech sector, the only way to hold them accountable is through regulation. Of course, there's room for self-regulation. Like, companies can always do more, but regulation needs to set the floor. um, and thankfully, we have lots of regulation globally. I just finished a global study of, well, a review, comprehensive review of all the online safety regulations that have been passed from Australia, where you are, to the UK, New Zealand, Singapore, the EU, obviously, the Services Act, even a lot of US states are coming out with digital platform regulations. So yeah, those have teeth if they're enforced well. And so for me, that's a crucial part of the equation. You can't anymore hope that the leaders will, take, uh, you know, will change their business practices to conform with human rights out of their own, volition or um, good, uh, good heart.
Yeah.
So that's to regulations essential.
Yeah, it's interesting. We've had quite a few um, people who are on the show who are working on the regulatory side of things or oversight directions, and um, I, I mean, I'm the founder of a technology firm that's building self-sovereign tools with a view to create a self-sovereign architecture, self-sovereign operating system, self-sovereign um, uh, software development kits for developers and so forth, all built around the ethical values within the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, even. But I find that the it's endemic across investors through to existing tech platforms, and even the citizens are not understanding the abuses that are currently happening. So I'm wondering also whether there's an education that's required for people. I mean, I still am amazed that people don't necessarily realize what intellectual property rights they're signing away when they upload a piece of content onto a social media platform, or what then happens in terms of real-time bidding of advertisers who essentially can are feeding a machine, multi-billion dollar, almost trillion-dollar machine that is, I view, pernicious and rapacious in terms of our certainly our data privacy, but from a fundamental perspective, I think that's an identity abuse. So, but then the defense is, well, these people have signed the terms and conditions, which no one read. But then their counter defense is, well, that ignorance isn't a form of defense. So where do you sit with this in terms of how? I don't want to become too hyperbolic here, but how bad are things, would you say?
So I'm an optimist by nature. So I think things will get better in some ways, maybe not every way and not very quickly, but um, right now, so we're talking about the tech sector in particular, and there are other sectors, but tech sector has been allowed to operate, like tech platforms, to be specific, have been allowed to operate basically without regulation for decades, in this kind of um, mode of cyber libertarianism, freedom, no regulation, no borders. And I think, you know, that was untenable. Like, people have come to realize for years now that there need to be some guardrails in the form of regulation or self-regulation or co-regulation, but there need to be some norms. And these companies can't just do whatever they want to do with data, for example. So, you talk about terms and conditions. Yeah, we sign off. we voluntarily give companies like Meta, and Meta is infamous in this regard, access to you know all our preferences, granular preferences. If you use one of their Quest headsets that track your eye movements, hand gestures, like your facial geometry, in that case, you're really not going to be, really exercising your autonomy very well, because the companies, they make money off of the data and make money off of selling that data to manipulate you through advertisements, basically. And people use those services. A lot of people kind of don't realize that privacy is important because they just, oh, well, at this point, I don't much care about my privacy. People, I don't have nothing to hide, or, these companies already have all this data. What am I going to do? There's a real power imbalance, right? If you're going to use any of these services, you just have to agree. There's no middle ground. This is, by the way, something that regulation can target. I'm going off on a parenthesis now, but regulation doesn't always mean, oh, you cannot provide this service to, or Australia just passed the social media age, basically a regulation where under 13 is kids cannot use social media platforms. So it can be very blunt as a tool, but it can also be actually very pro-innovation as a tool when, for example, regulation says you platforms have to start providing options for users to customize how much data they want to share. Or simply set the default setting as providing the company with as little data as possible, and then users can use toggles to kind of change that if they want to use certain functionality. So giving users more choice, basically. Regulation can allow for that. It doesn't always have to be setting those rules that prevent choice. So that's one point. But with regard to people's caring about human rights and taking right to privacy as one, I think many people just don't realize how invasive the technologies are, how much data the companies collect, and how easily they could use these profiles that they construct of us to then manipulate us, like to nudge us to make choices that we wouldn't want to make. And I worked on this issue in the context of 3D immersive technology, specifically the so-called metaverse, because any 3D immersive hardware, these headsets that you can wear, the Quest Pro and the Apple's Vision Pro, or Apple is a different case, but they by design have to track a bunch of your bodily movements, your limb movements, gait, your eye movements, and all of those things, when analyzed over time, can scientists have studied, reveal so much information about a person, even things that we might not know about ourselves, our sexual preferences, our potential vulnerability to illness, like tons of things. So when people say I don't care about privacy, they're just not really understanding like the magnitude of the threat to their own autonomy. And there's some regulation from the EU and other countries that protects users' privacy, but it doesn't go far enough. The enforcement is very much lacking, and so companies, by and large, in the sector do get away with a lot. I think the reason I say I'm optimistic is that now some countries and some regions, the EU is becoming more muscular about how it's going to enforce its regulation, the Digital Services Act. I don't know about the data privacy GDPR, but they're saying they're going to enforce it. And so if there are groups like ours who say, okay, now it's time to enforce it and you have to enforce it against these players, maybe, that will cause some things to change. It's a complicated picture because now US under the Trump administration is going to fight back against that and will use whatever bargaining power it has to cajole other jurisdictions not to enforce. So we're in for a showdown on the regulatory front, and in the meantime, the tech companies, I think, will just try to do as little as possible and keep using like rhetorical, very beautiful language. What they use in their documents sound very good. So to a consumer, if you just read what they say in their blogs, it sounds like they're doing a great job and they really care. And when you look at their actual practices and how they can change policy without much thought and consideration of the consequences, then you realize they care about their bottom line the most.
Yeah, they do. And so without being too overtly political in this question, but I feel I have to ask, only to fill in the rest of this picture somewhat. one could argue that the previous office of the presidency was potentially more um, pro um, human rights in terms of digital data privacy. But there could be an argument to say that the activities that some felt that were previous democratic supporters noted activities that seemed beyond the pale, and those activities could be including but not limited to forms of censorship that happened and forms of media manipulation. Do you feel that it's that it is certainly the case that to some extent the Republican presidency is not necessarily the most in tune with enforcing more human rights based regulations, and evidenced by, let's say, even Mark Zuckerberg on Joe Rogan's show, which basically means the largest media outlet that includes Elon Musk and Donald Trump and everyone in cahoots. That's for sure potentially moving us away from something that may have been more pro human rights kind of regulations. But do we also feel that the Democrats, to some extent, handed the Republicans that election in their um, alleged malpractice?
Yeah, so I'm not a political pundit, and I'm also very nonpartisan. I'm actually an independent, and um, I I'm for human rights. Like any administration, when they advance human rights, I will be very happy if to the extent, and no administration does everything right. So there's always things to criticize. I think the previous administration probably didn't do enough. They just didn't do much, to be honest. And so the opportunity to pass some comprehensive federal regulation didn't pan out. Like there was just no momentum. So one could criticize that just lack of action. Um, this kind of like equivocal way of doing things, or like you're not really like committed. I think the new administration is very committed to its agenda and is pushing forth in full speed. Um, some things that um, I think it's safe to say that human rights is not at the top of their agenda. Um, though maybe some human rights are. I mean, there are many human rights, right? So, workers' rights. I don't know. Maybe American workers' rights is at the top of their agenda. I'm not sure how they will deliver on that, but that's a promise, for American workers. And the whole agenda of the new administration is America first. So America's education needs first, America's healthcare needs first, and um, I guess that's good for if they do fulfill those promises. That would be good. I mean, I will be cheering that if they can allow more people in the U.S. to um, access quality education and quality healthcare. Um, that's great. I mean, I think that it's not their compass. It's not. I don't feel like human rights is a priority. For the previous administration, was it a priority? I don't think so. I think they were going through the motions. Um, I think that's as far as I want to say, because really it's not been my focus to judge a specific administration. First, I look mostly at companies, um, but it's when I can find allies in the government, or when there's common ground to be found, even with the opposing party, if you think of them as opposed, um, I would just go for it. I mean, for me, it's not a matter of, oh, this is not the administration I want to work with. I will be, I will not be working with the government. For me, I want to convince anyone, even people who might have different priorities from mine. I want to convince everyone that human rights matter, um, that they're not some utopian ideals that are unattainable. They're actually, as I write in that article that you started with, they're minimum standards
Yeah.
to prevent the most horrible treatment. Things that pretty much everyone agrees is against human dignity. And people who live in democracies, they take them for granted. So it's often the case, and going back to the privacy topic, because we live in democracies, we think, what could go wrong? You know, things are fine. I can just go use my social media app, and if they're collecting my data, fine. Or, if they're trying this and that, fine. But the slide to authoritarianism, I mean, I witnessed it in my country of origin, in Venezuela. Um, Countries do change, and rule of law breaks down. And then you devolve into a situation where human rights are not protected. And then you very much know what human rights are,
Yeah.
and how important they are.
Yeah.
So I find it hard to convince people who are very used to living in a democracy, my husband and others, that human rights matter, because they think, again, they just take it for granted that these things are respected, that there's due process of law, that you won't be dragged out from your house in the middle of the night and just, arbitrarily disappeared, or executed. These things happen in many countries where human rights are not respected. And so I think a big part of my job is to convince people human rights matter, and they're also very pragmatic. It's not like we need to only, fulfill this human right or that one. It's a balancing act. It's a very pragmatic system of norms, because the human rights system very much acknowledges that you can't maximize all the rights all the time. There's some, trade-offs at times, but the system of norms kind of instructs as to how you balance, for example, freedom of expression with protection from discrimination. These things can come into conflict, but then how do you resolve that? And it's a very practical thing faced by many companies and countries in the world. So, for me, human rights are the North Star. I don't know this administration or that one. They'll make mistakes. They'll do things contrary to what I think would be in line with human rights. But if you ask me which administration at least was more willing to say we believe in human rights, or we're trying to advance human rights, it would be the previous one.
Mm.
I don't know if they did that much for human rights.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's fair, and I think I concur. I agree that for me, I think human rights are a bipartisan issue. Ultimately, they're a fundamental construct as opposed to being either side of the aisle. It's interesting because many of the challenges that technology firms have are a factor of the way that the things are normalized to work. Like you finish business school or engineering school, you create a technology firm, and the investors, who I've spoken to thousands of over the years, are more than happy if you say we're running an advertising model where we have all of these users on the platform, and we monitor all of their information, and we can extrapolate information about them, and then we can sell adverts to them that influence their behavior. And investors write giant checks. They're over the moon. Like, really, it's a fantastic business model. And so it goes on and on and on, and goes round and round and round. And I in a similar way to how in the pharmaceutical world you have pharmaceutical companies who are investors or contributors to the regulators, and who are supposed to be regulators of the pharmaceutical companies. You have governments and regulators who are either funded by or contributed to the technology firms that are then the ones that are meant to be regulated against. And so I'm or regulated for, let's say. And I wonder whether, and I guess I would say this because I'm the founder of a human rights based technology firm, but I think that regardless of administration at the time of listening or watching, I think there's going to be either a cataclysmic event that happens where it is suddenly apparent to people what the outcome of losing your own digital identity rights are. So there's some form of sudden awareness, like a terrible outcome that happens, and people go, "Oh, that is because of this." And I can imagine some horrifically dystopian um, examples, but I don't want to fuel anyone's imagination who may be nefarious and watching. But I suspect that it might be more likely to be a slow. Sorry, that's my dog in the background. More likely to be um, a slow, gradual shift towards something that's more responsible from an ethical citizenship basis. And so I'm I tend to be more pessimistic and happy to be proven wrong versus optimistic and proven wrong. Um, and so I feel that people like you and I have a career's worth of semi-frustrating activity that never kind of stops in its struggle. Um, in the say of kind of, great people plant trees under which they'll never sit. I think it's probably our children's children that may look back 120, 150 years and go, well, it was my grandma that did, or in your case, or in my grandpa, in my case, that that was part of a chain of events. A very small, modest hand played in something that eventually had an impact that's palpable to someone in 120 years' time. I think that might be the best we can do. But I don't want a cataclysmic dystopian event to be the lesson, although that would make things more efficient. Yeah, that's what I think.
I think you're right. Those two seem like the two alternatives. Um, well, I guess another one is just those two are, I guess, the optimistic versions of what you say, because one they lead to an awakening of sorts,
Yes.
right? There's the other option, which is we gradually descend into darkness,
Yeah.
um, and then I don't know for how long. Um, yeah, so your two optimistic scenarios, which are not that optimistic, are I think nice. They're in I don't know in tech. All sorts of scandals. Uh, Let me just mention that prompt action. I don't know if it's durable action or awareness, but um, I work in the online gaming space and wrote about extremist exploitation of online gaming sites. Um, and every time that there was a mass shooting, which occurred, several times in the span of a few months, implicating someone who was radicalized in a gaming site, the companies would come out and say, of course, we have to do something, or whichever chat room or chat platform that the shooter had been using. Um, then there would be like a moment of awakening. Um, so I think that can often trigger action, um, and demands from the public, and action by policymakers and by the companies. But it has to be something pretty serious. I agree with you, to really cause like a sustained change. Because
Mm.
otherwise, I've seen too many times how one crisis, it's in the news, and this is a kind of function of our fleeting attention these days. There's too much happening. We're there, seems like it's an ongoing, onslaught of developments and crises. Um, and so the crisis passes, and the company just goes back to business as usual. So it has to be something pretty major to, I think, cause a significant change. The other one, the other option of some gradual like reckoning with the need to take a different course. I think that's what I envision. Let's just say, um, because of how I see. I mean, and I don't think it's a linear process of like gradually everything getting better all the time. But I think over time, there's more awareness, generations change, and you know, I think that uh, regulators get their act together, things start to get worked out. Not everything sort of gets better instantly, but I think over time, the reining in of a force like tech companies that are so powerful um, will have. That's kind of what I foresee, but I could very well be wrong. I believe in this kind of gradual because I think it leads to better outcomes. When there's drastic changes, I think it's often too much to the extreme. Like
Yeah.
it's either too much here, too much there, and I believe in like gradual deliberation, messy process of trying to get it right, incorporating many perspectives, trying to make adjustments, seeing what the backlash is, and then like working
Yeah.
on that. So I think that's how things kind of slowly get better. But not everything will get better, and there will, as you said, there will always be human rights challenges to work on.
Yeah. Yeah. True. Okay. Well, thank you so much. I'm going to. I well, I would like to keep in touch because I feel your perspective on this is needed and reasonable and diplomatic, but also I have to show bias in saying that I think you and I have, as evidenced in your writings online, all of which I've read, our view is similar, but not because I believe there is any form of partisanship of a view there. It is that from a fundamental humanist perspective, what we're talking about is something that we believe is that we're born with. It's probably the only, the human rights that we're born with is something that's incredibly important. And for people in the first world who have never heard or read about their neighbours or their family members being taken out onto the streets, or for people from cultures who have always been on the happier side of the story of slavery, let's say. And an African proverb from my ancestries is, until the lion learns to write, every story in the jungle results in the human as the victor. And so there is a fortunate position that many people in the developed world have been in, where the things that we speak about from a human rights perspective seems at best ideological and at worst conspiracy theory based. It's like none of this is ideological or conspiracy theory. It's a fundamental component of being human, actually. and and the fact that we even have to write articles about the abuse of human rights um, is is in and of it's a example of the problem itself. We shouldn't. I shouldn't actually have a TV show called Ethics TV. We should embed ethical principles into the things that are broadcast. So it shouldn't be something that stands aside from this, But anyway, okay. Well, listen, Mariana, thank you so much for joining, and um, uh, I will add in the description links to all of your stuff. The article we've mentioned, your LinkedIn, the NYU page as well, which gives signposts for everyone. Thank you for joining. I really appreciate it.
My